Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 2nd, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because we rely on the support of individuals just like you. If you would like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Sahaj Kaur Kohli. She's a licensed therapist and the founder of Brown Girl Therapy, the first and largest mental health community organization for children of immigrants. And she's also a columnist for the Washington Post's advice column, Ask Sahaj. She's got a new book out. It's called But What Will People Say? Navigating Mental Health, Identity, Love, and Family Between Cultures. So without any further ado, here she is, Sahaj Kaur Kohli. Well, Sahaj, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Me too. I'm excited to talk about your interesting work and also about your new book, But What Will People Say? So, and there's a subheading, Navigating Mental Health, Identity, Love, and Family Between Cultures. And I cannot imagine a more important time to be having this conversation. So why don't we start kind of going back a little bit? Maybe we should start, what do you think, with Brown Girl Therapy? You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Okay. So, yes, first of all, to it being the time that a book like this needs to exist.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. But yeah, so Brown Girl Therapy, it's all kind of tied together. So I like starting there anyway. A little bit before that, though, I want to point out that I'm a former journalist. So I worked in media for about 7 years, and it's something that I deeply loved doing. I loved working in the field. I did a lot of editing of personal essays. So what that means is that I usually was the one who would commission other people to write their essays, and I would edit it, and I would help them kind of format and put together and structure the essay that they wanted to share on something identity related. And so I have already been really fascinated by identity related stories, mental health, both for personal reasons, but also just professionally working in media. That was kind of where I tended to gravitate toward. So there came a point where I was like, I think I want to go back to school and become a therapist. And, I already had this really solid career. I was making this big change. And it was 2019 that I was starting graduate school to become a counselor, a therapist. And I was still working in media during that year. But it was also the same year that I got married to a white American man. And I am the first in my family to marry outside of race, religion, culture. So, and it was also the year that I turned 30. So there was a lot of personal and professional crises that I was kind of navigating at that time. What does it mean for me to choose this partner? Am I betraying, my cultural identity? Am I betraying my family in some way? What does it mean to switch careers just because I want to and have that privilege for the sake of wanting to pursue something that I'm really interested in, even though I already had a career that was kind of stable and that I was in? What does it mean to be a 30-year-old Indian woman where I come from a family and a culture where I'm really encouraged to think about having kids, getting married, prioritizing family over everything else? But here I am just choosing to switch my career, getting married to the person of my choice, and deciding to kind of pave my own path. And so during that year and kind of the year leading up to it, when I was going through the application process for grad school, I really felt myself returning to this question of, am I the only one who is struggling with some of these very precise thoughts and feelings that I'm having about my identity? And when I finally got into grad school, decided to move my husband and I up from one city to move to another city to go to school, I realized that I wanted to keep my foot in the media world in some way. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to start an Instagram account. I love writing. I love using storytelling as a way to connect with people and build community. It's the work that I did in media. So I'm going to start an Instagram account. And I decided to start Brown Girl Therapy, honestly, for selfish reasons. I wanted to find community for myself. I felt very alone in the identity crises I was having, but also just as a South Asian woman who was kind of paving my own path and doing things very differently. And when I started the community, it blew up almost instantly, which is something that I absolutely did not plan for. I didn't create it with the intention of saying, okay, this is going to become a business for me. This is going to be something that I'm going to do full time. It was honestly a passion project. And I did a lot of market research, and I realized at that time, 5 years ago, there were a lot of accounts like Therapy for Black Girls, Latinx Therapy. Like there were a lot of different mental health wellness accounts that were for other groups of people, other kind of underrepresented cultural, racial groups. And so I was like, I'm not really seeing anything for South Asians. But even then, when I would look at the Asian American platforms that were catered to an Asian American community, I realized that even then, right, that's such a broad population. And oftentimes when we think Asian American, a lot of people will assume East Asians, and South Asians are sometimes left out of that narrative. And so I realized that there wasn't anything that really spoke to specifically the mental health and wellness of South Asians. And that was all I didn't see anything that was just doing that work. So I decided to start Brown Girl Therapy. And I knew that it was really important to me to use I'm a writer first. I know I'm a therapist now. I've done a lot of stuff, but I identify as a writer first. And it was really important for me to use my story and write original content and kind of just see what happens. And like I said, it blew up. And what happened was I started grad school, and I was really emboldened by the fact that I was learning. For instance, I was in my first couple of classes, my first semester, learning the theories and techniques that were created and normed by white people. Or I was, in my ethics class, learning about how we're not supposed to have. There's like a strict policy around dual boundaries, but what does that mean when you are working with a community that's already underrepresented, and there's like a second degree of separation between me and other people who identify as my religious identity? So I was like having all these questions of like, wait, am I in the wrong field? How am I supposed to do this work in a way that's meaningful to me? Some of the stuff I'm learning doesn't really speak to me and my community or the community I want to serve. So I took all of those kinds of frustrations and tensions I was feeling and just channeled that right into Brown Girl Therapy. So Brown Girl Therapy really it grew with me, right? If you look back on my posts 5 years ago, they are very much a snapshot of who I was 5 years ago and what I was grappling with. And I think that really spoke to people. Just really trying to fill a gap and bridge between individualistic mental health care and the collectivist communities that are seeking something that speaks more to a family community oriented lens. And then the pandemic happened, and I think people were searching for wellness more than ever, especially within an underrepresented community. And somewhere along the way, I decided to just start talking about my identity as a daughter of immigrants. And that is really what took Brown Girl Therapy from being a page for South Asians to being a page for any and all children of immigrants. And I think at that point, no one that I knew online was really specifically talking about that very precise identity and how that impacts our mental health. And I'm very happy to see that there are so many accounts and pages and people doing this work now. We need more of us doing this work. But at that time, I realized I was really hitting a nerve and filling a void that just did not have anything representing it.
Yeah. So help me understand too, like for individuals who are interested in this kind of community and who, want to sort of be heard and hear other people that they can connect with. What exactly is it? You know what I mean? Like how do people engage with it?
In the community, you mean?
Yeah, like how does one engage with Brown Girl Therapy? Are they posts? Is it
Yeah.
resources? Like what exactly is it?
That is a great question. So it started off as just an Instagram account. It still exists as an Instagram account, but that was really where I did predominantly all my work. I didn't have a website until honestly this year, which is wild.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it really just was an Instagram account that I created content, and then people would the engagement was just wild. It was the engagement has always been, especially in the beginning, would always be hundreds of comments, people talking to each other in the comments. I heard of people saying, made a new friend just from engaging with them through the comments of your posts. I would then start, maybe 6 months in, I started to run what I called conversation clubs, which were kind of just these one-off, 1 hour Zoom conversations, especially over the pandemic where people were seeking community on a specific topic. So, one would be on money, one would be on being in an interracial relationship, one would be on workplace issues, one would be on finding a therapist. And people just kept coming back to these kinds of conversation clubs. And then I decided around the same time, I'm going to offer workshops. I'm going to see if people want to learn from me and all the research and expertise I'm building, and also connect them to one another. And people kept coming to those. And then over the years, it became more than just Instagram. It was really important to me after it grew exponentially that I had a space offline for people to be able to meet. And when I say offline, I'm still using the internet. There's still that, but I mean off of social media. So now Brown Girl Therapy is kind of a hub of resources and content and education for anyone who is seeking learning more about what it means to be well between cultures. And so there's the Instagram account. I have a newsletter called Culturally Enough that is a free and paid version. The free version, you get all of these resources. We talk about it. I dive into a theme specifically from a cultural standpoint. So I like to say that my work infuses culture into what the conversations we're already having about wellness. The paid version gets people community access, right? So we have Zoom clubs where people can meet each other. I have a community program that I just launched called Boldly Bicultural. It's a 4-month program where 40 people and I will go through this curriculum I've built based off of my book. So there's education portions, but there's also really, there's a lot of community care that is being had in this program. So there's lots of time for people to meet each other, to share their stories, to lean into community wisdom and peer support. And then there's also a chat a private chat that goes on through the whole program for people to lean on each other. And over the years, I was asked to be an advice columnist with the Washington Post. So a lot of my work that I do there, I've been doing it now for a couple of years. I've answered over 100 questions, and most of the questions I answer are all culture related. So anything that has to do with navigating or straddling more than one culture, or racial identity, being in an intercultural relationship, generational differences between parents and their kids. And I just feel really honored because I feel like all of the work I've been able to do through Brown Girl Therapy has now extended into other parts of or other opportunities of work that I've been able to do that is all focused on just infusing culture into these conversations. And then, of course, the book. So I feel like there has been a lot of growth over the last few years. And I feel like when people want to engage, there's different levels of engagement that can happen. There's social media, there's, the book, there's actually meeting people. And then I do a lot of corporate speaking engagement. So that is one aspect of my work I've really loved doing, which is being brought in by companies, either for their conferences or employee resource groups, to really talk about culture in the workplace and how culture and identity impact the way people show up at work. So there's lots of different kind of avenues of my work, and it's just been really, really fun. And I feel really honored to be able to grow it in the way that I have.
I love it. And so how then did the book come to pass? What kind of encouraged you? Because it's funny, when you were first talking about your path, obviously there is no direct path. But I see so many parallels with my own work, and individuals who are listening to the show have known me I've been on air for 10 years now. I too was a journalist and a science communicator and
I
television
didn't know
host.
that. I love
Yeah,
that.
yeah, for many,
Yeah.
many years, like 15 years. And I went back to school in 2017 to get to complete my PhD. I had done my master's in neuroscience years ago. I'd started a PhD and left. And I just finished last year my PhD in clinical psychology. And so there's like so much,
Congrats.
thank you so much. There's so much parallel there. And at the same time, I cannot imagine having written a book doing all all of this work that I'm doing. So I'm super curious. While you're in it, you're collecting hours, you're doing coursework, you're continuing with all of the activism work that you're doing. What sort of inspired you, and how did you carve out time to write the book?
Yeah, I will say, in building Brown Girl Therapy, it was hard. It started right before the pandemic. I was also a newlywed. I had moved to a new city. I was, for the first year of graduate school, my 3-year program, I was actually still working full time in media. So it was a lot. And I think Brown Girl Therapy was actually my like place of salvation and peace. I feel like building the community has served me as much as it has helped other people. It has shown me that the thoughts and feelings that I have, sharing my story has allowed me to tackle some of my own shame and guilt of my experiences and the things that I have felt or the questions I've had. And so in that way, it didn't feel as much like work building the platform. But I will say, because I come from a media background, it became very obvious that social media is snippets. It's hard to go deep. I still try and I'm still a long form writer, but at the end of the day, people are going to read parts of what you post and then they're going to go on and then they're going to forget it. And that's it. And as I was creating content over the years, I have like documents and documents on my laptop of just research, of ideas, of long form writing, of things that I want to put into a 140 character tweet. And I just feel like I accumulated all of these ideas and content that it became very obvious to me that I had a book in me. I had, like, there was already a book that was being built, even if I didn't know that that was what was happening. And honestly, it was the community that kind of encouraged that as a next step. If I look back on comments, I would screenshot when people would be like, "Are you going to write a book? When are you going to write a book? I would love a book. I would love a chapter in a book on this, or I would love to read a book from you." It just became those requests just became more and more over the years. And eventually, literary agents started reaching out to me, and I started being like, okay, this seems like a really possible next step. And the process just kind of happened. And I feel very, again, I keep using the word lucky. I know I've worked hard, but I also recognize that I created something that didn't exist. So, I do feel like I'm the first to kind of build this kind of a platform for this specific population, and I think people were seeing that. It was also at a time when the pandemic was happening. People were really struggling with mental health. We were dealing with a lot of systemic racism, things happening in the US. The publishing industry was holding itself accountable for needing to be more diverse. There were a lot of things at play that kind of helped advance this into a way I didn't realize. Like, I always thought it would take me more time to write a book, but I think because of the timing of everything, it happened a lot quicker than I anticipated. And I'll say, my editors were really great. The book was supposed to be, I think, from getting the book deal back in 2021. I'm pretty sure the contract said the book would be done within like a year or 18 months. And it took me 3 years to write the book. So my editors were very patient. They were very understanding because not only was I in grad school, seeing clients, doing all this stuff, building Brown Girl Therapy, I was also dealing with a lot of family medical issues during that time. And so I feel very lucky that I had editors who were kind of just trusting the process and trusting me. But I will say, I mean, it's one of the hardest voluntary things I've ever done. I had to say no to a lot of things. I missed baby showers, bachelorette parties, birthdays. I would work into the middle of the night. I wasn't taking super good care of myself. I had to start my own personal therapy, go on anti-anxiety medication. Like, there's a lot behind the scenes that people don't see, right? They just see the finished products. They just see that you're doing this. But it was incredibly difficult, and I'm very grateful to be on the other side, and I'm also very grateful to have it behind me.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And now that you do have it behind you, I'm curious, to spend maybe the rest of the time really digging into the content of the book. What would you say? This is always a hard question to ask, but what would you say really is like the central thesis? Like, what are you hoping that people get out of the book?
I think that's a good question. I think what I want people to take away as a general I think what a general takeaway is for the book is there isn't just one right way to be well, to have healthy relationships, to take care of yourself, to be a working person in your professional career. Um, to communicate, to set boundaries, right? There's just not one way to be well and to do any of these things. And I think that's the general takeaway in my book, is that I think for so long, for so many of us who live in the West, who grew up in the West, who might be the first people in our families to be born in the West, we are being socialized in an environment where there very much is a narrative that there's one right way to do these things. You know, when you set boundaries, you're supposed to be explicit and say no. When you communicate, you're supposed to be assertive. When you are taking care of your mental health, you should be like prioritizing yourself over other people. Like all of these things, these narratives that just aren't very culturally inclusive, because fundamentally individualism versus collectivism means that there are diametrically opposing values, norms, and expectations at play. And there are so many of us, even, racial populations, where they might not be from other countries, but there's still collectivist values within the family systems. And my book just really, as I said, it infuses culture into these conversations. So instead of saying you're wrong, that's not the way to be well, I just want to add another layer. It's almost like doing a Rubik's Cube. Like I want to just add another face to this conversation and say, hey, here are some other ways to think about this. Here are some other ways that we can also be well that may not be the way that you're used to being told, or the way that you think is right. And I say that's the biggest takeaway, because the book isn't just for children of immigrants. Yes, that's the main audience. I'm a daughter of immigrants. I've built a community for children of immigrants, but it's really for anyone who knows, loves, works with anyone who straddles more than one culture. And I would bet almost everyone listening to this probably does know, love, or work with someone who straddles more than one culture.
For sure, for sure. I'm curious, in your practice, obviously there's probably quite a bit of translation, both of research and personal experience, but then also of direct clinical practice that you sort of infused into your writing. How do you, as a therapist, and this is something that my degree, although it's in clinical psychology, I'm oriented as a sort of existential humanistic psychotherapist, and then my concentration is in social justice and diversity. And I kind of straddle. I'm sort of in the second group that you mentioned. Like I present as white. I am very white. My mother's Puerto Rican. She's first generation, but my father is a white man. So I'm skip step generation, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
a half second, and so, but I'm like one of these Latina women who like speak Spanish very, very poorly, and that's definitely not like a language that I'm fluent in. And very often when I'm working with clients, I live here in Los Angeles. For example, like Latina clients who are experiencing cultural pressures, let's say like machismo culture pressures in their relationships, for example. There's this difficulty as a therapist of maintaining cultural, let's say, contextualism and having core values, my core values, intersectional values, which are rooted in sort of feminism and anti-patriarchy and anti-white supremacy. Sometimes they butt up against one another. And so I'm curious about your ethical navigations when you're working with clients, especially in this kind of complex space.
Yeah, I mean, it is really complex, right? And I think curiosity is always my go-to when I feel like I am also feeling that internal tension between values, or between even personally, right? What I think people should do, or how people should operate. Of course, as a therapist, it's not my job to tell people what they should do. So I always lean into curiosity, right? It's not, I've worked with clients who come to me and say, I found you because I love your work and I'm a child of immigrants in some way. And then we will start talking about it. And through curiosity, we will explore that their cultural, their heritage cultural identity is not actually that important to them. So who am I to say, well, you should still honor that value. You should still do that, right? So having curiosity has always been my kind of North Star for figuring out what the client needs in those moments, what they want, what they're impacted by, how they view things. And I always just turn to those questions to help guide the work that we're doing. And, there are things that I do with every client, regardless. Not all of my clients are children of immigrants. Not all of my clients are people of color. But no matter who my client is, I will always, in the first couple of sessions, broach cultural or racial identity in the room, whether that's exploring my racial identity and how that will impact them, or their racial identity, even if they're a white person, because whiteness is still a racial identity, and culture and what that means for them. I have clients who, when we explore the concept of culture, it comes down to socioeconomic status. It comes down to having grown up in an urban environment. It comes down to things that, I don't automatically talk about in my work as cultural identity, but it's still culture, and it still has its own book of expectations, values, and norms that impact the way that they show up. And so for me, it's always really important to ask those questions and discuss those things up front, and then always revisit it in the work. I am curious though, like when you talk about the tension that comes up for you, I know this is an interview for me, but
Yeah, no, of course.
this might help further the conversation. Are there specific things that come up for you? Because I heard you say potentially working with, Latina clients, you may or may not have that identity or be white passing or whatever it is I'm wondering if that's the thing that comes into the room
Oh,
that
like a
brings these
sort of
up.
countertransference there. No, I
Yeah.
think
Or
more
is
that
it,
I'm just like
okay.
an abject feminist, and sometimes
Okay.
when I see
I
cultural
see.
norms
Yeah.
that are
Mm-hmm.
contrary to that, there is
Mm-hmm.
this, obviously I think that there's I love to grapple with the idea, and maybe I think this does broaden the conversation a little bit. I remember learning way back when I was getting deep into multicultural psych, that there has long been a tradition of teaching sort of two extremes, either cultural relativism or cultural absolutism, right? Like cultural relativism, I have no say in anything moral because that's not my culture. I didn't grow up in it. Coming from the outside looking in, I'm not in a position to moralize. And then cultural absolutism, my morals should be morals that everybody across the globe follows. These are fundamental to human nature, right? And both of these extremes are worrisome to me. I more cover a cultural contextualist view, which is that while there are many cultural norms that I do not understand and that I need to approach with humility and curiosity, there are some core cultural, or I shouldn't say cultural, but moral values that I believe do transcend culture. And many of those cut deep into my kind of feminism. And so that's where, and honestly, anti-racism. And that's where some of those difficulties come up. And I think we mentioned at the very top of the show, what better time than to discuss this? Because when you superimpose it on, let's say, modern American culture, you could kind of say that there is a red culture and a blue culture, or a Southern culture and a coastal culture. And I'm I'm I struggle with the idea of cultural humility in the face of, let's say, white supremacy, for example.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And that's and taking that into context, that's not at all. I also would not approach. I think cultural humility wouldn't be the right words there.
Right, right.
I think for me, I have done work, personally, professionally, with people who, as you say, kind of um, have morals or struggle with cultural norms or accept cultural norms that are harmful or hurtful to someone in their life and or themselves without realizing it. And sometimes the work is going back to that fundamental basic of, how is accepting this serving you? How is it actually hurting other people? How is it actually hurting you? And sometimes my clients are or are not willing or able to engage in those types of questions. And I think, it's something I also deeply grapple with, which is, those ethical limitations that we have, where there are situations where I just want to be like, this is absolutely not okay. But at what
Right.
point am I allowed to say that? And what is the work? And I have to remind myself, and I mean, maybe this is a cop out. Maybe this is just to make myself feel better. But I will often have to tell myself that, A, they keep coming back to see me for a reason. B, challenging someone does not mean challenging them in their entirety at once, right? Challenging looks like baby steps sometimes. And C, I have to just by my nature of the work that I do. I do believe that my job and my work requires me to meet people where they are and not where I want them to be. And that ends up being work that I have to do personally outside of the session for myself to kind of either grieve or rage or accept the feelings that come up for me, but also come into the room and say, okay, this is where this person is. How do I find new and interesting and fascinating ways to engage about this that will help them see it from a different perspective? And sometimes it's just using motivational interviewing as a technique that I just really love for most things, because there are often times where you can pick up on a little bit of change talk, you can pick up on a little bit of like word choice, and I will really hone in on it. Well, you just said this, and I've heard you say that this is not at all how you feel. And yeah, it can be very uncomfortable, but I believe in that gentle confrontation is necessary, because we are also vessels for whatever happens in the room. You know, we are vessels for what happens outside of the room for our clients in a lot of ways. And I think it's like, it's a privilege and it's a burden and it's a responsibility, and there's no clear cut answer of how to deal with that.
Absolutely. And I think a point that was sort of implicit in your description is a fundamental point that most therapists who are, early in their careers struggle to grapple with, which is that you cannot give somebody insight. I wish you could. Therapy would be a lot easier. But the point is for people to get to the place that they're capable of getting to on their own. You're there to facilitate, you're there to provide, alternative perspectives, to hold up mirrors to behaviors, to reflect back experiences. But you cannot tell somebody this is what you should do. Because even if you did, and we always use the example of an individual who's in, for example, a deeply, deeply abusive relationship, and you're sitting there fighting the voice in your head that says, just leave him, But like, they've heard it before. They know it. They've got to get there in another way because there's something preventing that behavior from happening. And I think that's really where the work comes in.
Absolutely. And the work is in the relationship, right? Because oftentimes that may be the only space they have where they're not being told what to do, or they're not being dismissed or invalidated, or they're not being, abused in some way. And I think that that goes for also like moral differences, where therapy and the relationship with the therapist and the client can often be where the work is done to even explore some of these differences, explore different points of view, to explore differences in perspectives. I've worked in settings where I have used my own racial identity in the room. Well, how does that show up now that you are talking to someone who looks like me and you're saying this? And that is sometimes the work of just using immediacy and saying, well, here's a microcosm of a relationship that exists outside of this room that we can use as an example to talk about this further. And I think that sometimes that will help. That helps me, contextualize it immediately with my client in a way that allows them to then have to face it head on in that room.
Absolutely. It's so fascinating because I feel like part of this discussion is about, the empathic experience of an individual who has maybe one foot in two different cultures, or who is experiencing sometimes conflicting or complicated pressures on their identity development, on their decision making in their life. But then also part of this conversation, which is so fascinating to me as well, is this core question that I often grapple with philosophically, ethically, morally, which is, what is the purpose of therapy? And why do people seek therapy? And what kind of responsibility does a therapist have to their client? What kind of responsibility does a client who is engaging in therapy have to themselves? And I think it's funny because when I talk to other therapists about this, when I talk to people who either have just who have been to therapy or who haven't been to therapy but have never worked in the field, that's already a difficult question to answer. But when I talk to other therapists about it, it's always so interesting that it's like, that's not necessarily, people assume, oh, that's what you learned day one. Like, it's not an easy question to answer.
It's not. It's absolutely not. And I mean, I don't even know how to say this on a podcast, but there are so many people I know who are working therapists that the way I work is fundamentally very different than the way they operate as therapists. Like there is no, we are not all the same. We do not all, we are not, there's no, even no matter how hard you try, we are not blank slates. We are not all using the same techniques. We don't all have the same perspectives on certain values, norms, expectations, techniques, modalities, how to do it in the room, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to say it. And so that in itself already just adds a different layer to this question of like, what is our purpose? Because everyone's going to come at that with a different, very individual, unique take on what that means and why they do what they do. And I do think many of us come to this field because we're healing something within us, or we've observed something, we've witnessed something, we've noticed something that we become really passionate about and want to help tackle. But I don't think that that's always the North Star for people who are in the field.
Yeah.
I think.
I think it,
Yeah.
it varies. I think that it's changing. So much of that has to do with personal, like what we personally bring to the field. I think so much of it also has to do with the training model that we chose. I happen to go to a school that social justice is like their number one priority, and it's infused in everything that we do. We have significantly more graduates of color than most other schools. It's an alternative model. The APA does not love us. We are accredited, but constantly on the ropes for it because it's this like hybrid model where people usually start later in life and they might have other careers and they have children and they're caring for aging parents. So a lot of it's online, and the APA hates that. Although we did great during the pandemic. Um, but I also think, you and I do have a form of privilege in that we chose to do this work after having done other work, and that informed our decision. Whereas many people fall into this. They get an undergraduate degree in psychology and they go straight through to get either their master's or their PhD or PsyD in a clinical or counseling or social work field. And then they're practicing when they're in their mid-20s.
Which is wild to me. Can I just say I'm not saying that young therapists are bad therapists at all. That is not at all what I mean. I just think it's wild. I could not imagine for myself being a 23, 24-year-old therapist. I just can't imagine it for myself. It's I can't conceptualize the kind of therapist I would have been.
Well, and I think that's also why you see differences in the types of fields that people go into. So I work in a cancer center. I'm very interested in end of life and existential suffering, and I'm also interested in gerontology. And I did my PhD internship in a gerontology clinic. And I found that while I was there, my co-interns were in their 20s. They were like more mid to late 20s, but a lot of them were not interested. Like I was the only one who was doing gerontology work, and the vast majority of them were working with children. And I remember talking to some of them about it because I was like, ooh, I don't want to work with children. They're like, I don't want to work with older adults. And I was like, why? I was like, they're so fascinating. The experiences are so rich. And they were like, what could I say to them? Like so many of them had that same sort of fear of like, I'm barely, an adult. And so they felt more confident, I think, and more competent working with littles. And I found that really interesting. Like, I wonder if part of the reason that there's a dearth of practitioners wanting to work with older adults is simply because the training model produces practitioners at a very, very young age.
Maybe, yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I think, yeah, I
Yeah, who
don't,
knows?
I don't, yeah, who knows? I don't know. And, I know plenty of clinicians who are much younger who are great. I'm also I'm a baby clinician. I've only been in the field for 5 years now. And,
Yeah, same.
I,
I mean, yeah.
yeah, and I feel, but I don't know that I ever want to outgrow feeling like a new clinician, because I think I hold myself accountable, and I hold myself to a standard of wanting to keep learning and acknowledging that I don't know everything. And I've seen it the other way, right? Where there are older clinicians, much older clinicians who've been in the field for a lot longer, who are just set in their ways. And so I think age, I think our field is one field where age serves us as having wisdom and having experiences that we can understand and bring to the table when we work with, different clients. But I also think it's a field in which it's easy, like other fields, to get complacent, and it actually we can cause more harm by doing so. And so I think that coming to the field later for me personally, and this is just my personal experience, also helps me hold myself accountable to wanting to make sure that I'm doing it right, that I'm not hurting my clients, that I am approaching it from a lens that, speaks to me, that is useful, that is helpful, that is um, humble in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. I think that it's sort of I feel very similar to you that it's the best of both worlds. I had experience, and I'm older than you as well. I started in 2017, and I finished my PhD in 2023. That's when I defended my dissertation. I was a month shy or 2 months shy of my 40th birthday when I defended, and so now I'm finishing my postdoc. And applying for licensure soon, and it's like it's a whole thing, but but I think it is the best of both worlds in that I have accrued more life experience, but I'm also still new to the field. And so I can come at it very often like new individuals do, with very, very fresh eyes, and sort of um pressure, like adding pressure or adding a new perspective, or really questioning some of the tropes or the sort of axiomatic thinking that may be dusty. And you talked about this early on when you first were exposed to learning about therapeutic models, or myself, because in psychology we also learn like a lot about assessment, and so much of like early psychological, actually still to this day, psychological assessment is founded in like eugenicist movements. And so and we know that, and as a field we know that, and as a field we grapple with it, but I think that there's a spectrum of how much we grapple with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I when early in my first semester of grad school, I actually had a really hard conversation with my ethics professor, who was an older white male who was pretty well known in the counseling field. And I had told him about coming, that this is me. I'm coming from a media career. I have written personal essays. If you Google my name, you will find personal essays on the internet. I'm not a blank slate. I can't be a blank slate. Like, I use media and social media in my business as a person who likes to storytell. I'm a public, writer, author, speaker, all of these things that I shared with him. And I told him about brown girl therapy, and he immediately said, you have to delete everything about you on the internet, including brown girl therapy. You have to delete it all. And I immediately burst into tears. I was like, I'm in the wrong profession. Like, what? I didn't realize that there were such rigid and strict parameters around how I'm supposed to do this work. I just want to help people. I just want to help my community. And I ended up setting meetings the next day with two professors of color who at that point weren't even my professors. I just found them in the roster of professors in the program. And I was like, hey, you don't know me. I'm not your student yet, but this is who I am. This is what I'm dealing with. And thankfully, both of them were like, absolutely not. Do not delete it. What you're doing is, trailblazing. It's incredible. Yeah, yes, we can talk through ethics. We can, always have these conversations. We know that you're doing everything intentionally. I never misrepresented myself. I never pretended to be a therapist when I wasn't. I always was honest about things. And they saved me, and they saved my work, because I was very close to leaving the program. I was very close to being like, well, screw this. This is not for me. I guess, as a woman of color who wants to serve a community that, where dual boundaries may not be able to exist, or dual relationships may exist, or that I'm online and I'm sharing things about myself. Like, I guess this isn't for me. And I will never forget that. I write about it in my book, but to this day, I think about what my life would have been like had I deleted brown girl therapy and I just opted out.
How frustrating too, and I'm so sorry that you had that experience, that one individual's personal take, which I'm I don't want to make any assumptions, but it sounds like they may have been much more either like deeply psychodynamically oriented, or they just came from an older tradition where sort of the therapist is supposed to be the blank slate, which is just not, like as an existential humanist thinker, that's not my clients depending on, whether it's in service to them. They know things about me. I self-disclose. I'm a human being, and I'm in the room with them, and we're co-creating something. But yeah, how frustrating that professor or that individual couldn't have just said to you, because this would have changed everything. Hey, this is how I practice. This is something that is really important for me ethically, but each individual has to find their own path. And there's nothing in the ethics guide that you are violating. There are just things that are probably important to grapple with.
Yeah. And that's what these other professors were able to give me. They were like, I don't have a public social media, but that doesn't mean you can't. Like, here are things we can consider. Here are questions for you to consider. And I've grappled with my role as a therapist and a public kind of person who is, you can find things about me on the internet. I am very open about my life. Um, I grapple with it every day, but it's something that I choose to grapple with, and it's something I'm making intentional choices around every day. And the same thing happened with the book, right? The book is very vulnerable, very open. I share a lot about my life story. I share things that many therapists wouldn't want any of their clients to know about them, knowing that some of my clients may end up reading this book and learning more about me, and it may end up impacting our relationship. It may impact the way future clients do or don't want to work with me. And I remember through the book writing process, I just always came back to the same intentional question and answer that I sat with over and over again, which is, if I publish this book and I could never be a clinician again, would I be okay with that? And my answer was yes, because I'm a writer first, and I feel like I love being a clinician. I love the work I do as a therapist, and I can help more people writing this book than I could being a clinician. And that was just my answer to a question that I needed to figure out for myself. And I've had mentors who thankfully have been able to support me along the way and understand what my values are, where my parameters are, within the ethics and integrity that I want to stand in. But they've never imposed their norms onto me, unlike that first professor who did. And I just think, there's already so much privilege that I grapple with in being able to be a therapist. It's very hard. It's very expensive. It's very long. It's very time consuming. And then feeling like I was already being pushed out by someone who wasn't even trying to understand where I was coming from. Why brown girl therapy? What does it do? What does it serve? Who does it serve? There were no questions. There was just an immediate, this is what you need to do.
And what a perfect encapsulation or microcosm of the very experience of individuals seeking therapy in a predominantly white field. And to be clear, it historically was a predominantly male field. Now it's actually predominantly female field, but it's still wildly overrepresented by white clinicians.
Yeah, yeah. And it's this conversation just brings up the other thing I grapple with, which is just working in a broken mental health system, right? We think about today's, day and age, the state of the world and the country that we exist in, and how hard it is for people to get the care that they deserve. And I grapple with it all the time, which is why my community activism, advocacy work is so important to me. Because I just think that I have to find ways to make the work I do more well-rounded in order to feel like I can have impact and make a difference in a system that doesn't always serve the people I want to serve.
Absolutely. And I think it also stands kind of reinforcing for the listeners who obviously probably don't ever navigate these ethical principles that a point that you made, I think, is a really, really important point, which is that you can be you as a therapist unabashedly. I can be an outspoken, for myself, I can be an outspoken atheist. I can be an outspoken bicultural. I can be an outspoken bisexual therapist who has core values rooted in anti-racism and anti-patriarchy. I can say all of these things out loud. There can be therapists who are, Palestinian. There can be therapists who are trans. There can be therapists who are whatever they are out loud. And as a client, you can choose to see that person or not. The difference is we can't choose not to see you as a client simply because of your cultural identity. That is against all ethical guidelines. If somebody comes to me and they say, this is my belief structure, and I say, oh, then I can't serve you, I should not be in the mental health field. But it doesn't run the other direction.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing too, is if you can, access care, you do have a lot of choices and agency around who you get care from. And I think people tend to forget that, especially, in the community I serve, in the brown girl therapy community. A lot of times people are like, I can't find a therapist. How do I do it? How do I make sure this therapist who may not share in my identity can still help me? And I have, in my book, I have a whole post, like an interstitial chapter of how to find a therapist, questions to ask them, because I think people forget that you have agency and you're paying someone for a service. I think people forget that. And I like to tell people it's like hiring a graphic designer. I'm not going to hire any graphic designer just because they're a graphic designer. I'm going to make sure their aesthetic matches my aesthetic. I'm going to make sure I feel like they're listening to what it is I want from my website. And maybe I'll decide, okay, you know what? This is not actually a fit. I can't really communicate to this person what I want or need, and they're not listening to me, or they work very differently than what I'm okay with. I'm then going to just find a different graphic designer, and that's okay. And it's the same with a therapist. You don't need to just work with a therapist because you found a single therapist to work with.
Right. And the literature backs this up, hugely. Like, there are a lot of different ways to approach therapy. We won't get into it. We don't have time. But like, if somebody's more cognitively behaviorally oriented, or if they're more existential humanistic or psychodynamic, and what the literature shows is that all of that comes out in the wash. Like, there is no approach that is superior to another approach in the long run. What fundamentally predicts positive outcomes in therapy is relationship. It's
And
rapport.
comfort.
Yeah, if you do not have a good, trusting, safety, comfortable relationship with your therapist, and you know that usually within the first session, you do not have to keep going to them. Find somebody who you feel safe and comfortable with. You are the person hiring the therapist. It's not the other way around. And I think because our healthcare system is so broken, a lot of people really fundamentally in their bones don't understand that, because that's not really how medical care is delivered. They don't have a lot of choices. And so this is one of the things that, I work in a very large hospital, and I mostly do outpatient work throughout the week. But on Mondays, I'm in the consultation liaison psychiatry department. So I'm going to patients' bedsides in the inpatient unit of the hospital, not a psychiatric hospital, an actual, level 1 trauma center hospital. And when I'm seeing a patient, doing a consultation, working with them, sometimes giving them resources for how they can seek outpatient therapy once they leave the hospital, I always give that spiel. Like, you are the one hiring the person. It's not the other way around. You need to recognize that you are in an empowered position. It's a hard thing to remember, because very often we don't feel empowered in the healthcare system, but you have a choice.
Yes, and even during therapy, right? A lot of some of the questions I get is, "Well, I've been seeing this person and now I don't know how to like ask them about this or talk to them about this or tell them this." And my answer is always like, "You owe it to yourself and the care that you're getting to be honest with your therapist. Hey, can we revisit goals? Hey, we haven't talked about this thing in a while. Hey, I actually want to talk about this instead." Those are all perfectly acceptable things to say to your therapist.
Yeah, and like, if you're worried about hurting your therapist's feelings, it's actually really important to bring that out in the open, because that's really good fodder to grapple with in therapy. Like, your therapist wants to hear that from you. If you're like, I want to push back, but I've been scared because I don't want to offend you. Like, oh my God, let's work with this. That's something that is like, we're hungry for that in therapy. But what we don't want is that sort of same enactment that happens where somebody doesn't feel safe, doesn't feel secure, and sort of keeps their head down and says, I guess I'll do whatever you say. That's not an appropriate therapeutic relationship, and it's not going to foster growth.
No, and the therapist doesn't know what you don't tell them, right? A therapist isn't going to assume you're lying about things or assume you're hiding things. They'll ask questions. They'll try to pick up on what they can pick up on with nonverbal cues or maybe like whatever they hear, but they don't know what they don't know. And it's so funny you brought that up, the fodder piece, because I've had a couple clients this week be like, "Oh, I was almost canceled because cared about you and I didn't want you to feel like you had to like take care of me this week." And that was our whole session, was like, let's
Oh,
talk,
right, because
let's
of
unpack this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and just to be clear, because we're recording this, it's not gonna air immediately. That's because of the outcome of the election is what you're
Yes,
talking
yes,
about.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Same,
yes.
same. Today, this week was a tough week, and God, we could talk about that for hours, but unfortunately, we're right up against the hour, and so I hate cutting it short like this, because this has been such a fantastic chat. There's so much more to say, but I do wanna do a quick plug for the book. But what will people say? Navigating mental health, identity, love, and family. between cultures. And also, of course, for Brown Girl Therapy. Everybody, her name is Sahaj Kaur Kohli. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for this really great chat. I feel like I could talk to you for probably another 5 hours.
Same. Maybe we'll do it again sometime. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.